I remember the night it all began, child. I had gone to visit your father's house, carrying a basket of fresh bread I had baked with my trembling hands. The lights were on, laughter spilled from the dining room, but when I stepped through the door, the laughter stopped. My daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eyes, her lips curled with a smile that wasn't a smile at all, and she whispered to my son, my only son, loud enough for me to hear. "Why do you still let her come here? She's just a burden. She has nothing left to give you." And he said nothing. Therefore, I stood there, frozen, with the smell of warm bread in the air, and my heart breaking quietly inside my chest. The silence between us, child, was louder than any cruel word. That night, I walked back to my little house under the dim streetlights, holding that basket like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I whispered to myself, he is my son. He will remember. He must remember. But days turned into months, and months into years. 9 years passed. 9 long years where my phone never rang with his voice. 9 long years where holidays came and went, birthdays arrived and vanished, and I sat alone, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. But you must know this, child, I was not always this bent, frail woman you see in front of you. No. I was once strong, once fierce, once alive with the fire of survival. And since you asked me tonight why my hands tremble when I hold my tea, I will tell you the truth. Not the polished truth people use to look brave, but the raw truth, the one soaked in sacrifice, in pain, and in the kind of love that almost destroys you. Therefore, listen carefully, because my life was not easy, and yet every hardship carved the woman I became. When I was a girl not much older than you, I married your grandfather. He was kind, yes, but we had nothing. No house, no money, just a dream and a little bit of hope. I worked 2 jobs, scrubbing floors in the morning, sewing until midnight, while he worked at the mill. I walked to work in shoes with holes at the bottom, and when it rained, I felt the mud seep into my socks. But I smiled anyway, because I believed all the struggle would one day bring comfort for my family. And then came your father, my only son. The moment I held him, I promised myself he would never know the hunger I had known. Therefore, I worked harder. I skipped meals so he could eat. I stayed up nights learning numbers and papers, because I dreamed of building something more than just survival. Do you see that old wooden chest near the window? Inside are the first papers of my little company. It was nothing at first, just me and a borrowed sewing machine, stitching clothes for neighbors. But every stitch was a prayer, every fabric a promise. And slowly, child, it grew. From 1 customer to 10, from 1 sewing machine to 3, until the day came when people started calling it a business. But success came with a price. For every dollar I earned, I lost a night's sleep. For every praise I received, I carried another scar of exhaustion. I missed your father's school play because I was at the shop. I missed one of his birthdays because I was meeting clients. I told myself it was worth it, because one day, he would understand that his mother had built something from nothing. Therefore, imagine my pain when the very thing I built, the very sacrifices I made, were used against me. Your father grew up watching me work, but instead of seeing the love behind my sacrifices, he heard the whispers. His wife told him I cared more about money than family, that I was selfish, that I built my company only for myself. And instead of remembering the nights I went hungry so he could eat, he believed her lies. Child, nothing breaks a mother more than watching her child's heart turn cold. And for 9 years, I carried that wound. But do not think I sat here only weeping. No, I worked, I endured, and I kept my silence. Because sometimes silence is stronger than words. And as I grew older, as my back bent and my hair turned white, something unexpected happened. The company that began with 1 sewing machine grew into a giant. People from cities I had never seen came to me. My name carried weight. And one day, without fanfare, without even trying, I sold that company. Do you know how much they paid me, child? $18 million. Yes. 18 million for the hands that were once mocked, for the nights of hunger, for the years of silence. But at that very moment, I remembered that night in your father's house, when my daughter-in-law whispered, "She has nothing left to give you." And I smiled. Therefore, you must understand, this story is not only about pain. It is about patience, about how time reveals the truth. It is about how a woman cast aside can rise higher than those who trampled her. But the story is not finished. No, child. For the real test came after the sale, when news spread, and suddenly, after 9 years of silence, there was a knock at my door. Child, I still remember the sound of that knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, as though the person behind it wasn't sure they belonged there. My heart froze in my chest. For 9 years, no one had come. For 9 years, the only sound at my door was the wind, the mailman, or a neighbor bringing me soup. But that night, the knock carried a weight I could feel in my bones. Therefore, I rose from my chair slowly, each step heavy, as if I were walking toward my own past. I opened the door, and there he was, my son. Your father. His face was older now, lined not with wisdom, but with the kind of stress that comes from listening to the wrong voices. His hair had grayed at the temples, and yet when I looked at him, all I could see was the boy I once held against my chest, the boy who once clung to me when thunder shook the windows. And beside him stood his wife. She wore her smile like a mask, wide and polished, but her eyes betrayed her. They were sharp, calculating, watching me, as if measuring the space between us. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling just slightly. "It's been too long. Too long. Too long." The word stung, but I did not let my face show it. I simply nodded and said, "Yes. 9 years is a very long time." Therefore, I let them in. The air felt heavy as they crossed the threshold. My little home, humble and warm, suddenly felt too small to contain all the silence that followed us to the table. They began with small words. Questions about my health, about the weather, about whether I was lonely here. But I knew, child. I could feel it. Their words were not questions born of care, but of something else. Finally, my daughter-in-law leaned forward, her voice sweetened with false concern. "We heard about the sale," she said. 18 million. Mom, that is such a blessing. God has been so good to you. And of course, family is everything. We should be close again, don't you think? Her words cut deeper than knives. Because where were these thoughts of family when I sat alone at Christmas? Where were they when my birthday passed in silence, when the world forgot me except for the ticking of the clock? But I remained calm. I sipped my tea, though my hands trembled slightly. Family is indeed everything, I answered, my voice steady. But sometimes, family forgets. Your father lowered his eyes then, as though my words struck something inside him. But his wife did not flinch. She pressed on, leaning closer. Well, the past is the past. We can make things right now. You've worked so hard all your life, Mom. You deserve rest. You deserve support. Let us help you manage everything. The money, the property, all the responsibilities. It's too much for one person. Child, do you see? Her mask slipped then. What she truly wanted was clear as daylight. It was not about me. It was about what I now held. Therefore, I smiled. Not with bitterness, not with anger, but with a quiet fire that came from years of wounds finally closing. I appreciate your concern, I said softly. But I carried this burden alone for decades. I sewed until my fingers bled, I scrubbed floors until my back ached, I starved so that my son could eat. And no one came to say, "Let me help you manage." I was alone then. And I can manage now. The silence that followed was deafening. Your father's lips parted as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. His wife's smile stiffened, her eyes narrowing, but she quickly masked it again. And then I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and said, "Tell me something, both of you. Where were you when I knocked on your door 9 years ago? Where were you when I sat on Christmas with no one to share my table? Where were you when I heard my own son agree with the words, 'She has nothing left to give'? Where were you then?" The weight of those questions filled the room. My son shifted in his chair, shame flickering across his face. But his wife's lips pressed into a thin line. Therefore, I knew the truth. Forgiveness is easy to ask when there is something to gain. Child, that night, they left my house with polite smiles and promises to visit again. But I saw through them. The years of silence could not be erased by words. I had given too much, and they had given nothing but absence. So I decided then, quietly, that if they wanted to test me, if they wanted to treat me like a foolish old woman, who would bend simply because they remembered my name again, then they were about to learn who I truly was. Because I had been silent for too long. And silence, child, has a way of turning into strength. Therefore, I began to plan. Child, I told you that silence turns into strength, and strength, when tested, can become fire. That fire was burning inside me the night they left my home with their false smiles. They thought the old woman they had ignored for 9 years would fall into their arms simply because they came knocking with words dipped in honey. But I was no longer the same woman who waited for their calls. Therefore, I prepared myself for the storm I knew was coming. Within weeks, the calls began. First, it was your father, his voice unsure, asking how I was. Then, it was his wife, speaking of family dinners, reunions, birthdays. She even said, "The children miss you, Mom." Children I had not seen grow, whose voices I had not heard in 9 long years. Each call was a rope they were trying to pull me in with, not ropes of love, but ropes of greed. And then came the day they asked me directly. "Mom," my son said softly, 18 million is a lot to handle. Maybe you should let us help. We could invest it, make it grow. It could secure the family's future." But I laughed. A laugh so sharp it startled even me. "Secure the family's future?" I repeated. "Tell me, son, what future did you secure for me when I ate alone at Christmas? When I lit candles on my birthday with no one to blow them out? When your silence was my only companion? Was that securing my future?" He lowered his head then, but his wife, she pressed on. She said the words that revealed her heart in full. "You don't need all that money, Mom. You're old. What will you do with it? It's better for the younger ones to enjoy it now." Child, those words, dripping with entitlement, broke the last thread of patience I had. Therefore, I acted. I gathered the entire family. Yes, your father, his wife, their children, and even distant relatives who had long forgotten me. I invited them to a dinner at a fine restaurant, one they could never afford on their own. The table was long, the plates polished, the food rich with flavor. Laughter filled the air, as they believed I was ready to share my wealth. But when the plates were cleared, I stood. My old hands shook, not from weakness, but from the weight of the truth I was about to deliver. "You all came here tonight thinking this dinner was about money," I began. "And in a way, you're right. But it is not about what you will receive. It is about what you will never touch." Gasps rippled down the table. My son's eyes widened. His wife's smile froze. "I sold my company for 18 million, I continued, my voice steady. "And I have already decided where every penny will go. To charities, to orphanages, to young women starting their own businesses, to scholarships for children who remind me of myself, hungry but full of hope. Every dollar will build futures for those who know the value of sacrifice. Not a cent will go to those who abandoned me when I needed them most. The silence that followed was sharper than any blade. My son's hands trembled against the table. His wife's face turned red with anger, but she said nothing, because the truth was too heavy to fight. And then I looked at them one last time, and I said, "You turned your back on me for 9 years. You whispered that I had nothing left to give. But tonight, you see, I had more than you could imagine. And I chose to give it not to you, but to the world. That is my revenge. Not cruelty, not shouting, but choosing to bless others instead of those who cursed me." Child, I walked out of that restaurant with my head high, the night air cool against my face. Behind me, I heard no footsteps. Only silence. Therefore, understand this: revenge is not always fire and fury. Sometimes, revenge is living well, giving wisely, and leaving those who wronged you with nothing but the echo of their own choices. And the moral, my dear grandchild, is simple. Do not betray the hands that raised you, because life has a way of circling back. Love is the wealth that lasts, and respect is the inheritance that outlives gold. But greed leaves you empty-handed. Therefore, when you grow, remember my story. Carry it in your heart. And never let the words, "Why is she still alive?" or "She has nothing left to give," leave your lips about anyone. Because one day, child, those words might return to you. And that will be your burden to carry.